A brief word of Torah this morning. As we looked at this morning in our open book, the remarkable legacy of a very strange midrash that appears in the Talmud of Masachet Chulin on Daf Samech on page 60, brought in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, 3rd century Palestinian Amora, who notices in the Torah a very odd moment in chapter 1, verse 16, where the Torah describes the two great luminaries. That God creates two luminaries and calls them Gedolim, great. And then immediately after describing them as great, the Torah then says, the great one for the day and the small one for the night. This oddity in the text, which could easily, if Occam's razor were deployed, as I said earlier, the most elegant explanation is, they're both great. One's smaller, but they're both great. But something in this shift in language from both of them being Gedolim, the word great, to one being called Gadol and one being called Katan, catches the eye of this 3rd century rabbi, and he creates an incredibly powerful and strange folk legend. Apparently, he says there was something missing from the text. And in between the greatness of both luminaries, a conversation occurred between God and the moon. And in this folktale, the moon comes to God and says, is it possible for there to be two kings who use the same crown? Two kings with the same crown. And God's immediate reaction in the legend is, you're right, and since you were the one bothered by it, then you should be the one who gets the smaller crown. Don't make yourself smaller. Immediately, though, in the midrashic mind of this Shimon ben Pazi, says that the moon spoke up again, and she says to God in this folktale, wait a second, but my complaint was a legitimate complaint. At which point God doesn't say, no, it wasn't. God says, you're right. And then God goes through 2 or 3 renditions of trying to appease the moon for God's initial reaction. Saying, okay, I made you small, but at least it'll be great because there'll be some really great people who will call themselves small. Almost like a mafia, it's like some Shmuel that's small, Shmuel HaKatan. King David will be called Katan in the book of Samuel. So God says it's not so bad to be small if really big people call you small. And the moon is having nothing of it. The moon is like, no thanks. It still bothers me. Thank you for giving me, some really poor comfort. And after that, God offers another way to comfort the moon. And then in this final rendering of this folktale, of this legend, God finally admits that God made a mistake. And that every new moon, which is a celebration of the rebirth of the smaller moon, God says, I will bring a kapara, I'll bring an atonement offering for my mistake. I can tell you right now that a lot of ink has been spilled trying to make sense of this very strange legend. Every year I say that I'm going to want to learn. There's a mimer. In Chabad. There's a book this big on this alone called Ma'amar Shnei Me'orot. Mystical, Kabbalistic. I'm just going to use one approach, one mahalach, one approach that's brought in a number of places. There's a world where the sun's power is such that it overwhelms. It's big. All of life depends upon it. Nothing grows without it. The heat of the sun, its strength is absolutely remarkable. No one can fight, and nobody can argue that the sun's power is not beyond our conception. We can't even look at the sun. We know it's there, but only in a sense because of everything that it affects. When the sun is out, there is no room for anything else but the sun. The sun's power is such that darkness can't abide. And we orient ourselves by the seasons to that magnificent luminary. And And then there's another reality called the reality of the moon. The moon's light is gentle and soft. The moon's light is such that even in the darkest place, we can count on the moon's reemergence. The moon, it's true, moves in rhythms, sometimes up and sometimes not, sometimes illuminate and sometimes dark. But the constancy of the moon is a much closer reflection of human beings in their own, right, in their own fluctuating illuminate, their luminosity. The moon is approachable. The sun isn't. And for generations of Jews, for 2,000 years, we imagined the moon not as a diminished sun, but as a mother whom we could always talk to. A mother whose love was ever present, even when we felt it wasn't visible. We knew it was there. We always loved the moon. The moon was the closest thing we had to experiencing God in the darkness of exile, knowing that we felt in some way that we had sometimes no light of our own. We were entirely dependent on the whims of those who we were living with. And we would throw ourselves to the moon and say to the moon, just as you would disappear every month but then reappear, also maybe we might also reappear in our strength. We also might become powerful. But Jews for generations saw in the moon a promise. One day the moon will be valued as much as the sun. The light of the moon will be as important as the importance of the sun. And great rabbis who described the moon's flaw also saw in it the moon's greatness and dreamed of a time when, if the moon represented the divine feminine, the mother, that the power of the mother would be equal to the power of the father. That the power of that energy source, which was different than the patriarchal, powerful, dominant, imperial, colonialist power, would one day be an energy that we might also harness and we might also value for its beauty. And so in our tradition, the moon, even if in this Shimon ben Pazi's wild, wild legend, even if the moon has been diminished for no good reason, God acknowledges and laments it. Every month when the new moon is, renews itself, we Jews would say, one day it won't be like this. One day it won't be that the new moon or the moon is in some way degraded and diminished. One day. So I want to say, friends, that I think, as I said earlier this morning, and I don't believe that just because someone is born a woman, that you necessarily are more lunar than you are solar, by definition. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. But yet again, we have now, and not to say that the elevation of a woman to become the most powerful person in the world would necessarily now mean that we're in a lunar phase, but it would mean a heck of a lot. It would mean a heck of a lot. It would mean a heck of a lot. I don't know, and I'm not saying, I don't think a synagogue or rabbi ever should weigh in on whom they're voting for. It's not a political position, my bima, and the bima here at Ramu. But I remember that feeling back in 2016. I remember the hope and the prayer. And there were lots of things about Hillary Clinton that did not sit well with me and with many people. But there was a moment I thought that this country was going to touch the moon, not just land on it. That there was something remarkable that was about to take place and transform how we understood what the face of power looks like. And I'm still praying for a much more lunar world, for sure. Whether it's with men, women, everything in between, that human beings will be able to, in some way, shape, or form, harness not just the power of solar energy, but the power of lunar energy, of that gentle light in the night that helps us read and find our way, especially when we can't see ahead of us. But I feel in a couple of weeks from now, we'll have another moratorium on the readiness of this most powerful of nations to be able to see this sin, as it were, of God, and to help rectify it a little bit. To be able to lift up the power of the moon, the power of the feminine, the power of the mother, the power of a smile and deep laughter. And that we might have, in that way, we might be able to do tikkun levana ourselves. We do kiddush levana ourselves and say, kishem shani roked kenegdech, in the rite of there's a custom to bless the new moon. And we say, just as I am on my toes trying to reach you but can't, may all of those who are my enemies also not reach us. And that we might be inspired by the moon to bring a softer energy into this world, an energy that is more in alignment with rhythms, more in alignment with listening, more in alignment with waxing and waning, more in alignment with a natural cycle of illumination. I pray that that's the case. And I pray with all of you, I'm sure, that the light that the diminished light, as it were, is appreciated for its own beauty, and that it isn't called diminished, that the moon's light is not diminished, but it's gentle, it's different, it's powerful, and it might yet show us the way towards a much brighter future for all of us. I pray that that's the case, and amen.